All right, well, I'm going to get us started. My name is Hannah Zeller. I'm the programs manager here at the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. And in my role, I have the unique honor and privilege of working with the DBSA Young Adult Council. So I am so pleased to introduce Jamie, Olivia, and Maddie, who are going to discuss the importance of how we discuss mental health. So I'm thrilled that they are joining us today to talk about this important topic. I want to let you know that we will be using the Q&A function during this session. So if you have questions during the session, feel free to pop them in the chat, but largely we will be answering those questions at the end. But as you think of them, ask any questions in the chat, and I will also be monitoring the chat if you have any technical questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to begin introductions. Olivia?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. We are super excited to hopefully have a really productive conversation about word choice and why it matters. Just really quickly, myself, Maddie, and Jamie, we're going to introduce ourselves. So my name is Olivia. I'm from just outside of Louisville, Kentucky. I've been with the Young Adult Council since 2020, with DBSA since 2017. It's a great organization with a lot of great volunteers. And I've lived with chronic depression and generalized anxiety disorder for a little over a decade now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm from Orlando, Florida. I've been with the YAC also since 2020. And I struggle with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and social anxiety disorder. I'm also a first-generation college student, and I'm currently halfway done earning my bachelor's degree in psychology.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maddie. I live in Chicago, Illinois. I've been with DBSA's Young Adult Council since 2020, and I live with depression and anxiety as well.
Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide and just give you a quick rundown of today's agenda. Hannah did this well earlier, so we're just going to be real quick. So DBSA has something called a compassionate language guide, which you can find on dbsalliance.org is the website. And it's basically just a set of 10 guidelines for being really thoughtful about what you say and how you say it. So today we're going to break down each of those 10. And then we're going to talk about how to practically apply that information. So hopefully you'll know why that matters and then how to put it into use. And then we'll save some time at the end for audience questions. So we'll go ahead and skip to the next slide, and Maddie's got a couple questions to get y'all thinking.
Thanks, Olivia. So just some things that I want everybody to think about as we go along. Throughout this presentation, like Olivia said, we want this to be like as applicable to your real everyday life as possible. So we've got some examples here of stigmatizing language that you may have experienced or you may have heard other people say in daily conversation without even recognizing it. So some examples here, the weather is so bipolar. You're so OCD when referring to someone who just, likes to be clean and organized. My ex is a psycho, or I'm so addicted to this TV show or this brand of chips or something like that. And as we go along, think about also if you've ever intentionally changed your language to avoid stigmatizing words or phrases, or have had to point it out to other people when they use it in their own language. And if we go to the next slide, Jamie is going to discuss why it matters.
So why does this all matter? Why is it so important to consider the words we use when we're talking about mental health? Dealing with mental health issues, it's a very difficult thing for many people, and it's certainly not something we want to keep in the dark. Talking about it is very powerful and can bring a lot of healing to people. But mental health is a sensitive subject, and sometimes it's difficult to talk about. I was watching a TED Talk recently, and the speaker mentioned that we know what to say when we talk about physical illness, but mental health is different. This is due to stigma, but also because the language surrounding mental health, it makes it difficult to have a regular conversation. We don't usually want to associate ourselves with being, psychotic or unstable or things like that. We want to feel understood and validated. And one of the ways to feel validated is by talking to people. But as we all know, human beings are not perfect, and there are going to be times where people will talk negatively about mental health. So here we can see some of the ways that negative language can influence people struggling with their mental health. So negative language surrounding mental health, it has the potential to minimize people's pain. So for example, in situations where people might, make someone is feeling, what that's implying is that their emotional pain is not as bad as it seems, or it's not as bad as someone else's pain. And when people use words that downplay people's emotions, it makes them feel like their feelings don't matter. And it also alienates people. I especially relate to this because when someone says something misleading or hurtful about my mental health struggles, sometimes it exacerbates my depression. It makes me feel like no one truly understands me and makes me feel even more alone. It also prevents people from getting help. Some people feel like if they can't talk to those around them, then who can they talk to? Especially if a therapist or other professional uses negative language with them, people might feel that all therapists will treat them that way, so they choose not to reach out for help. And it also brings up feelings of shame, inadequacy, hopelessness, and other emotions. So for a lot of people, simply admitting that they're struggling with their emotions makes them really uncomfortable. And then, we add hurtful comments, into the mix, and it makes people feel even worse. So, there are a lot of feelings that come up when discussing mental health, and those are just some of the reasons of why our words matter. So next, we'll discuss the first principle of DBSA's Compassionate Language Guide, which is allow for personal choice.
So this is going to be kind of an overarching theme for this session, this first principle, allow for personal choice. When we were brainstorming this session, we all knew that we don't want to come across as the word police. We don't want to tell you always say this, never say this. But it's really important to allow people to feel respected by honoring their wishes when it comes to language. So to give you a quick personal example, at my former place of work, this happened during the summer. Some of you all might know about it. Beyonce and Lizzo both came out with songs in the span of a couple months, and both of them originally used the word spaz as a slang term. And it ended up being a really good learning moment for them because they didn't know that was, and I didn't know this either until this summer, that that's an offensive term for someone with cerebral palsy. And so instead of, sticking with their original lyrics and, not being pushed, they decided to go back in and re-record it and take that word out. And so one of my coworkers was talking about this, and they said, I don't see why it's a big deal. I'm not offended by that word. It's because that word doesn't apply to them. So a lot of times, the way that I think about this language and being compassionate is allowing people experiencing conditions or illnesses to decide how they want to be referred to. If someone says that a word is offensive to them, it's not up for you or me to decide that, no, it's not offensive. It's that person telling you. And so it's just a basic level of respect, I think, to honor that person's wishes. And Jamie, I think you have some to add here as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said, Olivia. We don't expect everyone to go around and act like therapists, trying to figure out what to say and how to say it to everyone. I admit for me, when I talk to people, it gets emotionally draining because I constantly feel like I have to watch what I say or try not to accidentally offend anyone. I just try to respect everyone's preferences and keep up to date with all these language changes. And it gets tiring, but that's not what we want people to feel like. We don't want people to feel like they have to constantly walk on eggshells when discussing mental health with people. We just want to encourage people to be aware of the words they use and how those words can affect others. These are general guidelines and they will vary between individuals. Just as the slide says, our goal today is to help you choose language that makes yourself and others feel respected. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and move on to the next principle of the Compassionate Language Guide, which is Defy definitions. When we say defy definitions, what we mean here is that we don't want people to be defined by certain words. So for example, the term mentally ill carries a lot of negative connotation to it. If someone refers to me mentally ill, instead of allowing that word to define me as a person, I choose to defy that definition, meaning I don't consider myself to be this sick, hopeless, miserable person all the time. I just have a lot going on in my brain and it deeply affects my emotions. So it's important to know that we're not necessarily defined by these definitions and labels presented to us, and that, it's okay to go against them sometimes. And Maddie, you had, I think you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add on to what Jamie is talking about as well, that particular words mean different things for different people. And this is something that we have to acknowledge. Generally speaking, like Jamie said, using the word illness in reference to mental health conditions or mental illness comes with different meanings, context, experiences, and definitions depending on the person living with it. And we cannot limit ourselves to understanding terms exactly the same for everyone. So something to keep in mind is that context is always key, depending on who is discussing a certain diagnosis, for instance, or other definition in relation to mental health. Looking beyond what defines, let's say, depression according to the dictionary, or every single symptom checkbox in the DSM, can help us relate to others based on their individual experiences. This goes along too with other terms that are typically associated with or included within mental health discussions, like recovery and resiliency. What recovery means and looks like to me can look wildly different to the next person dealing with seemingly the same issue or mental health condition, or even the exact same diagnosis. Recovery for me can look like finding and practicing successful coping skills when I'm especially depressed or anxious, while recovery for someone else might mean getting to a place where they no longer even experience symptoms anymore. Recovery also means something completely different for those living with mental health conditions versus addiction, those with injuries or physical illnesses, people in physical rehabilitation, and on. So it's important to take these differing experiences into account and look for and ask people for context as well, so that you're not just basing what they're talking about on one singular definition. Another word that often comes up within this conversation is resiliency. Resiliency is a common term associated with those living with mental health conditions, but similar to recovery, is a term ripe with various meanings, implications, and context. And depending on the word's use, and it can almost excuse lack of accommodations or understanding if someone responds to the disclosure of living with a mental health condition as being resilient. So although we've come a long way, and rather than shaming people for living with mental health conditions, we've moved towards acceptance in our society, and resiliency is oftentimes a response to, disclosing this information to someone. For example, if I'm in the workplace and I tell my boss I'm having a rough morning because I'm going through a depressive episode, and it makes it especially hard for me to get out of bed in the mornings, and she responds with, thank you for telling me, you must be so resilient, having to deal with ongoing symptoms like that and pushing past your struggles. Although that is a great step in the right direction, she may not be addressing the changes that could actually be made or physical accommodations that might be available in that space to help me as an employee and to help make the space more equitable. It's using that as kind of a band-aid for acceptance, kind of bypasses the structural inequities by praising someone for being resilient. And if you do that, you want to make sure you're pairing it along with actions that would be a much more supportive response. So that's just something to think about as well when we're talking about defining definitions. And now, if we go into the next slide, Jamie's going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say mental health versus mental illness.
So like Maddie just said, certain words mean different things for different people. And there are two in particular that I want to briefly touch on because they're so common in society, and that is mental health and mental illness. And again, these words will be interpreted differently by people, but I will be speaking about them in a general way. So mental health and mental illness, these are terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, but they do not mean the same thing. I have two definitions here from the American Psychiatric Association, and they define mental illness as health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior, or a combination of these. Mental illnesses are associated with distress and or problems functioning in social, work, or family activities. In contrast, they explain that mental health involves effective functioning in daily activities resulting in productive activities such as work, school, or caregiving, healthy relationships, and the ability to adapt to change and cope with adversity. So as you can see, there are differences. One is a health condition involving distress and problems functioning, and the other is all about effective functioning. But it gets tricky even within these differences because people still interpret mental health and mental illness in different ways. So some people view these terms on one continuum, where one is here and one is way over there. And in other words, someone is either completely mentally ill or completely mentally healthy, or somewhere in between. But other people view these terms on two different continuum, where you have one spectrum about mental health and one spectrum about mental illness. When referring to the mental health spectrum, someone is either experiencing good mental health, poor mental health, or somewhere in between. When referring to the mental illness spectrum, someone is either experiencing severe mental illness, no mental illness, or somewhere in between. And I have a YouTube video that actually shows this. It's kind of hard to explain here without a picture. But my point is, no matter how you choose to look at mental health and mental illness, it's really important to know that just because a person is struggling with their mental health does not necessarily mean that they have a mental illness. Likewise, just because a person has a mental illness does not necessarily mean that they are incapable of functioning and feeling happy. So with that, that brings us to our next principle, which is choose thoughtfully. So we understand the importance of words, the allowance of personal choice, and define definitions. But what about when you're actually having a conversation with someone and you're trying to figure out what to say? What are some more generally appropriate words to use? So starting with the first example listed here, instead of saying that someone has a mental illness, it could be more helpful to say that someone has a mental health condition. Like I said earlier, the word illness has a lot of negative connotation to it, and it implies that someone is probably sick and, maybe miserable. And the word condition can be a good alternative to that. Another example is, instead of saying they are bipolar, it could be better to say they live with bipolar. Some people don't like the former phrase because it somehow implies that they are their condition. They feel like it's a label being put on them. And perhaps one of the most controversial phrases is committed suicide, and Olivia will dive deeper into that.
Yeah, and I do want to just warn everybody, we are going to talk about suicide for probably the next 2 minutes or so. So if you need to put us on mute, go ahead and do that. But this is, instead of saying committed suicide, trying to swap that out with died by suicide. So a little bit of background about me. I used to work in news, and there is, very similar to DBSA's compassionate language guide, There's also a set of reporting guidelines for best practices on how to report about suicide and mental health. And this was one of the guidelines that was listed. And initially, when I started working, I didn't really get it. I didn't see what the big deal was. And then the more I thought about it, I was open to learning, seeing, why do some people feel this way? And the more I read up on it, I realized, oh, committed makes it sound like a crime, like committed murder, committed arson. And so now, luckily I had that learning experience. I kind of flinch when I hear committed. But, Jamie's going to speak a little bit to this later. She and I differ on this. We have different experiences and different perspectives. And so it really all goes back to that first principle, to allow for personal choice. I have a little bit more of a personal connection with failed suicide attempt. So I survived an attempt in 2016. And you'll see that's what the try instead says, survived an attempt. Just personally, when you say, you failed at trying to do that, that comes with a lot of negative emotions, because it's like you were already in a place where you didn't want to be here, and oh, you couldn't even complete that. So for me, it's much more positive, and it's more correct on my path to recovery to say survived a suicide attempt. But Jamie, like I said, you and I, we've got some different opinions on this, so you can share yours.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that the phrase committed suicide, because here's an example of how two people differ in their language preferences. So Olivia said to her, it sounds like a crime, but from my viewpoint, it doesn't. I'm personally okay with the phrase committed suicide. From my point of view, I don't associate my brother taking his own life with committing a crime. I see it as him carrying out an act. Some people are going to be okay with certain words, and some people will not. It all just depends on who you're talking to. So if you're talking to someone you don't know very well, it may be helpful to use these words that we're suggesting. And then when you get to know the person better, you'll be more aware of their preferences. So, it just really depends on the person you're talking to. But, there are going to be differences, of opinion, and that's okay. We can move on to the next slide. Continuing with the principle of choosing our words thoughtfully, there are two other things that we can look out for when we have conversations with people. So you may have heard of the term microaggression, and that is defined as a comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group. If you actually Google the word microaggression, you would be surprised at just how many of these comments we have used with people. I know I've said things to people without even realizing that my words were considered microaggressions. And on the other side, I've had things said to me that at the time I didn't realize were microaggressions. And I have two personal examples of when I experienced microaggressions, one involving gender and one involving disability. So I was at work once and I was delivering heavy items to a customer, and she saw me struggling to lift the item, and she seemed kind of surprised, and she offered to help me, but then she said, "Oh, I thought a man was going to be delivering." And that really caught me off guard. I didn't say anything because I was just so shocked, like, what am I supposed to say to that? The other example was when me and some other people were at a theme park and we were using walkers. I have fibromyalgia, and another woman had, I think it was spina bifida. It was something like that. I can't remember exactly. But me and the woman who had spina bifida stopped to take a break from walking, and an older lady, also using a walker, walked by us and said, "Oh, you young people need to learn how to walk faster." And at first I found it hilarious. Like, where did this lady come from? But, I felt offended at the same time, because when people make comments like that, it makes me not want to use any kind of assistive device. I don't feel like being judged by people. So microaggressions are things to be aware of because what we say to people can really affect them. We can go to the next slide. You may have also heard the term toxic positivity, which is defined by Psychology Today as the act of avoiding, suppressing, or rejecting negative emotions or experiences. This could mean suppressing your own negative emotions or others suppressing your negative emotions and insisting on positive thinking. So just like with microaggressions, many of us have engaged in toxic positivity without even realizing it. And many people have good intentions, when they're trying to help someone feel better. We want people to look on the bright side and see that silver lining. But, when we're feeling down and people tell us just to think positive or keep our chin up, sometimes that's just not helpful. I remember a former coworker of mine once said to me, "Jamie, you have everything you need. Why are you depressed?" And it was like an emotional separation took place after he said that. I felt so misunderstood, like he just did not get it. And it honestly made me feel guilty, and it made me question myself. Am I not grateful enough? Should I be more happy? And, whenever I was around a coworker, he was very nice, but I felt like I always had to be in this upbeat, positive mood, or else he was going to make me feel guilty about feeling sad. And I think, Olivia, you also had an example you wanted to share with that.
Yeah, and what you just said brought up another one for me. I used to do a lot of speaking for my DBSA chapter, and I was speaking at a church once and talking about how, some people certainly have life circumstances that contribute to their mental health conditions. But I was talking about how I often felt kind of guilty because, I came from a middle-class family. My parents are still married. And so I felt like I didn't have a reason to have depression. And after I gave this talk, a woman came up to me and she said, "Did you wear a coat last winter?" I said, "Well, yeah, it was cold." And where I'm at in Southern Indiana, it can get down to like 10 degrees Fahrenheit sometimes. But she said, you weren't the coldest person on earth. You weren't in Antarctica, but you still wore a coat. You still deserved that comfort. And that just really stuck with me, to know that I don't have to be the saddest or most depressed person or have the worst circumstances to feel what I'm feeling and deserve some kind of treatment and comfort. I also, going back to toxic positivity, want to highlight this disconnect that a lot of people have between physical and mental illness. So if I had a friend that broke their arm, I wouldn't say, "Oh, just do yoga." Or if somebody had strep throat, I wouldn't say, "Oh, just get over it." I think a lot of times, like Jamie was saying, these people come from a good place, but it's just not realistic. And so something better, in my opinion, if I, express a depressive thought, might be, "I'm sorry to hear that you're feeling that way. What can I do to help?" And that way you can still express care, but not this kind of toxic positivity. So hopefully that's helpful. And we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is the fourth principle. And Maddie's got that one.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, so this one we're going to be talking about avoiding distancing. And this is, talking about using language that kind of creates a gap between the person using it and the group of people that they might be talking about. So instead, we're trying to move towards a place where we use language that references people or individuals and reinforces their identity as important fellow human beings rather than, subhuman or lesser than. Generally, anything that alienates a certain group of people in any context is going to be harmful. People struggling with a mental health condition is no different. Using alienating, othering, or grouping language dehumanizes an entire group of people and contributes to viewing them in society as lesser than or not worthy of basic human rights and conditions as everyone else. It's sometimes easier to recognize this language when we're using it surrounding things like racism or sexism, things like that. It's a little bit easier to recognize, to say, why is this person trying to other this marginalized group of people? But it's a little bit harder, I think, to recognize when people are using it in reference to mental illnesses or those living with mental health conditions or even physical disabilities. So, if you want to think of it as in trying to avoid terms like them, those, or a blanket statement grouping a whole group of people together, like the mentally ill, something like that, and try using more just individual language, naming the person by their name, who they are, rather than grouping them together, can be helpful. And if for whatever reason you find yourself trying to distance yourself from associating with certain people in the way you speak about them, it can be helpful to just kind of take a step back and ask yourself why, because we've all done it. Maybe it's because you don't want that stigma to be attached to yourself as well, which totally makes sense, because it's kind of a human instinct to separate ourselves from something that we see as, anti-survival. But when you use that kind of grouping or distancing or alienating language, then the people you're referring to probably don't want that stigma attached to them either. And the language you might be using is just helping to perpetuate those negative associations and stigmas. So that's just something to think about as you reflect on your own language and the language you hear about those around you. So if we want to go to the next slide, this ties in pretty well with our next principle, which is separating the person from their condition. So as a professional writer, one of the things I learned early on in my college career was to always put the person first when describing someone in my writing, whether it be a fictional story or a factual piece or an essay. It just helps humanize the characters or real people you're describing, rather than just boiling them down to their diagnosis, which is something that we've discussed previously. And then I began adopting this into my conversational speak as well, realizing that I was inadvertently using person-first language in my everyday life, but not in my writing, which didn't really make much sense. Particularly when speaking on mental health conditions, nobody wants to be viewed as nothing more than a diagnosis or a disease. People are complicated and multifaceted human beings, and a diagnosis, in simple terms, is something that human lives with, not who they are. So their humanity should always, be acknowledged first and foremost. It's not that person-first language or separating the person from the condition is in attempts to police people's language, as we've talked about before, but rather displaying respect and empathy towards humans living their lives with a set of various challenges or hurdles, and what they have to, do to live and get past adversity. So you can try, rather than saying the harsher sounding, she is bipolar, you could try saying she lives with bipolar disorder. This, definitely helps humanize the person that you might be talking about, rather than just lumping them together as nothing more than a diagnosis. And related to that, in first person language, her son lives with autism instead of saying her autistic son. Those living with any kind of mental health condition, physical condition, or neurodivergency should be defined by who they are before their diagnosis or condition. So that's just something to remember as well. And then if we go on to the next slide, Jamie is going to talk about the next principle, which is don't make assumptions.
Thanks, Maddie. So just taking a break from what we say to people, it's also important that we don't make assumptions. So that's our next principle. It's really important that we understand that mental health conditions look different for everyone. Our experiences vary even with the same diagnosis. We don't want to treat all people who are depressed as this one big group of sad, suicidal people. Everyone is going to experience different feelings when it comes to mental health conditions. So for example, for me, depression looks like losing interest in things that I usually enjoy, having a lack of trouble falling asleep, sometimes strong feelings of melancholy, and a general feeling of hopelessness, etc. For me, anxiety looks like feeling restless, lack of concentration, sometimes having fast heart rate, which eventually may lead to fatigue, or in more extreme cases, needing to leave my house and go for a drive or just go for a run spontaneously. Everyone's situation is different. And it's especially important that health providers understand this as well. And Maddie will explain more about, Olivia will explain more about that.
Yeah, so I don't know the makeup of who all is on this call, but I think this sixth principle is really important, not just for individuals living with mental health conditions, but also for providers. As Jamie was saying, different people experience different symptoms. So not my first psychiatrist, but one of my psychiatrists in college would always ask, once every 3 months, how are your grades doing? Still passing all your classes? And I would always say, yep, still going good. And it was just very odd to me because she had never asked what symptoms I exhibit when my mental health conditions are, I say, acting up. So for me, it's never been grades. I've always gotten A's. Something more appropriate for her to ask would have been, how much are you sleeping? How much are you eating? And so even providers, I think, have this responsibility to recognize that not all people have the same symptoms. And in order for patients or clients to feel respected, it's really important to ask them what they experience. And then we're going to go on to the next slide, which is another principle: accept responsibility. So I've said this 2 or 3 times already this afternoon, that it's all about personal choice and making people feel respected, and just being respectful of your fellow people. So this was the story I'm about to tell is a learning experience that did not happen, unfortunately. I was watching American Horror Story Asylum. This was several years ago. And for those who don't know, it's about a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s. And in addition to all of the supernatural, spoilers, alien horror, there's also a very realistic depiction of the horrible things that did happen back then to people who were seeking treatment. And so I told one of my family members, they were like, what are you watching? And I told them about some of the awful realistic things that were being shown. And that family member said, you're really lucky you weren't born back then, because we would have had you locked up. And it just kind of took me back, and I just paused. And, I can only imagine what I looked like from the outside. I was probably shocked and got really quiet all of a sudden. And this was at a point where I was still very new in my public mental health journey and really being open with talking with people about it. And so at that moment, I didn't engage in a deeper conversation. I didn't say, wait, why would you say that? What do you mean? Because a lot of times when something offensive like that happens, if you're in the right headspace, it can be a really good opportunity for learning and providing some clarity to somebody. But at the same time, you also don't want it to be your job to constantly educate everybody. So we're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about how you can find that balance between taking care of yourself and trying to improve other people's understandings But before that, Jamie's going to speak a little bit on this slide as well.
Along with what you just said, Olivia, I just want to add that no matter what our occupations or roles are in life, there's always someone around us listening. You don't need to be a public speaker to get people's attention. Even in smaller interactions, like having a brief conversation with a stranger or acquaintance or coworker, people hear what we say and many people take it to heart. So just a reminder that, you know, we do have a choice in what we say to others, and we have the power to either unite with people or drive them away. And speaking of responsibility, the media has a huge role on this. And we can go to the next slide, and Maddie will explain the next principle.
Yeah, so number 8 in the Compassionate Language Guide is avoid sensationalizing. And I also am lumping into this romanticizing as well, because I think that is something that we experience a lot today. In addition. So I think sensationalizing and romanticizing mental illness and mental health conditions has always been prevalent, particularly in the media, like Jamie was saying. But I see it a lot these days, especially on social media platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Whereas the sensationalization of someone having a public mental health crisis has been used in the past, and even in the present, although arguably not to the same extent, in things like newspapers or article headlines to instill fear in the public of those living with mental health disorders, viewing them as dangerous people. The idea of sensationalizing and romanticizing a mental health condition is still common across social media today, but maybe even more sneakily or in a more like low-key, sinister way. With the progression of addressing mental health stigma in the last decade, it is, at least for young people, easier to recognize when a headline, like in a newspaper or a magazine article, is sensationalizing to instill fear, only using one part of a story as clickbait or for shock value. We've all seen this example in TV shows or media when, back in the 50s or 60s, news articles would come out reading things like madman chews off fingers in a restaurant and attacks people eating. That's something that can be easily recognized as sensationalizing. We don't know the full truth to that story. We don't know that person's experience. We don't know their diagnosis or anything else about their life or the condition that they live with. We're only seeing something that happened in public and was used as shock value to scare other people. The sensationalizing and romanticization can be a little bit more sinister these days when things like Instagram or TikTok accounts are dedicated to showing one side of someone's condition and only allowing the viewers or followers into one-dimensional view of living life with a mental health condition. And this is oftentimes done as a sort of clickbait today, where it was shock value back in the day, but it still serves the same purpose to really only show one side of living with a mental health condition, and just continues to further the stigma. Only seeing videos like that of someone's breakdowns or manic episodes as an example doesn't lend to understanding the situation as a whole or give a true view of what this person might be dealing with from a holistic standpoint. It really just gives a narrowed perception that furthers the sensationalization of those living with mental health conditions. You're only seeing the extremes of these behaviors. You're not seeing all the other points in their day or their lives of someone dealing with a mental health condition. So it's really not the full truth. And this shock value or clickbait really makes it easier for viewers to see those people as different and alienating and instilling fear, which just perpetuates the stigma. So definitely something to think about, especially on social media, as it can be a little bit more sneaky when you're just seeing these quick videos, quick glimpses into people's lives, can be a form of sensationalizing or romanticizing, not telling the full story and making living with a mental health condition look cute or quirky or something along those lines. It still serves as perpetuating a negative stigma and a narrowed view of a mental health condition. And this goes along with our next principle, if we want to go to the next slide, which is portraying people realistically.
So like Maddie just said, mental health conditions are so often exaggerated in the media. And this quote here from the Compassionate Language Guide basically sums it all up. Studios, excuse me, this is the wrong quote. But the quote that I'm about to say does not match the one on the screen, but exactly. But it's studios need to take great care in accurately representing the broad experience of people living with mental health conditions. People living with mood disorders, they are depicted in television and movies these days, but these depictions are not always accurate, and that can cause a lot of misconceptions. And one example that I saw was on TV. I was watching TV once, and this show came on, and before I could change the channel, I saw a scene where someone said, "Oh, he's having a panic attack," and the camera panned over and showed this man like writhing all over the floor, and that was just clearly not a realistic portrayal of a panic attack. This was a comedy show that I was watching. I do want to mention that. So it could have been displayed as a comedic act, but I really couldn't tell if this was the show's way of seriously portraying a panic attack. It misrepresented most people who have experienced panic attacks. And I don't think I'll ever know if that was meant to be a joke or not. But just be aware of what the media is portraying. It's not always realistic. And along with that, we'll go to the next slide. And one of the things that is mentioned in media a lot with people who struggle with their mental health is violence.
Yeah, so this is really unfortunate. I think a lot of times people accept headlines and news at face value. Earlier, Maddie was talking about not sensationalizing, and I think this plays right into that. The stats are out there for anyone that wants to become more educated on this. The stats on this particular slide are from mentalhealth.gov, and they're from February of this year. So according to mentalhealth.gov, only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to people living with a serious mental illness. Not only are those people less likely to commit those acts, they are way more likely to become victimized. So someone living with a serious mental illness is more than 10 times more likely to become a victim of violent crime than a member of the general population. So with this slide, I'd really say anytime that you hear a broad, overgeneralized statement about a person or a group of people, don't be afraid to use your friend Google and look for the real data out there and the real research, because this stigma has been perpetuated for decades, hundreds of years, and it's simply not true. So again, there's a ton of information out there if you're interested in learning more about this. But now, for the sake of time, we are going to move on to our next slide, which is how to apply these principles in your everyday life.
Yeah, so we've got some questions here that we're going to be touching on. What are some small ways you can incorporate mental health advocacy into your life, and how can you put compassionate language to use in your daily life? What challenges you might encounter, and how you balance self-care and education when practicing advocacy. So, you know, anyone can participate in mental health advocacy without it taking up too much mental energy or looking like what we typically associate with advocacy, which would be attending a protest or march, public speaking or volunteering, something like that. Even donating to a local community mental health center, a mental health advocacy organization, or your local mutual aid fund is certainly a type of low energy advocacy that anyone having the financial means can participate in. And just going along with all the principles we've just talked about, also making small, easy shifts in the language you use surrounding mental health can have a bigger impact than you might think. Simply replacing the word crazy in your vocabulary with a synonym like silly can make a huge subconscious shift for anyone around you and is totally considered a type of mental health advocacy. Taking an opportunity to stand up for yourself in the face of microaggressions or displays of toxic positivity can be considered advocacy. Letting others around you know that you're not just looking for inspiring quotes to fix your depression, but rather just need a supporting ear or a shoulder to lean on, can make a big difference. And the next time that person approaches a similar situation with their potentially unknowing toxic positivity, they'll think about that and put it to use. So these are all good examples of how language can be used as mental health advocacy. And Jamie, do you want to add on to this as well?
Yeah, a few practical things we can do to practice mental health advocacy. Maddie said some of them already, but just to get into examples, if someone is telling you about their mental health struggles, you can practice speaking compassionately to the person. Just swapping out one word can be enough to change the whole dynamic of a conversation. Or if you hear someone say something stigmatizing or hurtful to you, if it's appropriate to do so and you feel comfortable, you can speak up. You can even respond by politely counteracting the statement that someone said to you. There are many ways we can have healthy conversations with people. But, there may be times where the situation does not call for that. Maybe it's not a good idea to talk about it. And Olivia has a really great example of this.
Yeah, and just building on what Jamie said, I don't want anyone to feel like they have to be, like we said at the beginning, the word police or educate everyone. If you're in a situation where either psychologically or physically it's not safe for you to stand up, that's totally understandable. So my story here is finding that balance between wanting to educate people, but also needing to take care of myself. So I mentioned that I worked in news, and this was probably about a year and a half ago, maybe a year ago. The founder of a major restaurant chain died by suicide, and it was Texas Roadhouse. And so, of course, the place I worked at and all the other places in town ran stories about that because he was a prominent person in the community. But when I looked at our scripts for television and when I looked at our web story, there wasn't information at the bottom of what to do if you were experiencing those feelings. At the time, it was still that big long number, but now it's 988. Even just something as simple as including those 3 little digits at the bottom of the story is huge for people that, if reading that would trigger something in them, they've got the resource right there. And so I spoke to my boss and I said, hey, I really think we should add this to our coverage. I think I know it's part of the responsible reporting guidelines for suicide. And I think it's really important that we do this. And my boss said, absolutely, you're right. I'll send it out to the newsroom now. We'll get it fixed. And eventually we did. And so that was really, it was a great feeling for me because I knew, there's no telling how many thousands or millions of people were going to see that coverage. And then they are immediately directed to the resources that they might need. On the other hand, a few weeks later in the newsroom, one of my coworkers was saying committed suicide and talking jokingly about this person who had died by suicide. And it was all very offensive and I was angry at it, but I just didn't have it in my tank that day. And for me, the difference was, with the web story and the news coverage, that could impact so many people. Whereas this one coworker, I could kind of tell they weren't interested in learning. And based on conversations we'd had before, I knew that, that was their opinion and I wasn't going to be able to change it. And so I guess the point of this all for you guys listening is that it's okay if you have to make that distinction. And you can't always be the educator. You can't always be the teacher. If someone doesn't want to be open to learning, you can try as hard as you want, but they're not open to it. So that is one of the key takeaways, I would say, today. The other one being that first principle, allow for personal choice and respect people. So now I think we are going to move on to the questions section of the presentation.
Thank you guys so much for going through that with us and sharing that with us. I'm gonna pop into the Q&A, and we have a combination of questions and we have a little bit of fan mail too. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of both. I'm gonna start with some fan mail, excellent examples to illustrate content on the PowerPoint deck. I love this presentation. We can make this presentation available afterwards to folks who are interested if you email programs@dbsalliance.org. And then I'll move on to a question. Is mental health challenge okay? Does anyone want to take a stab at that one? And audience, continue to ask questions in the chat. We have about 15 more minutes in this session.
I can jump on this one first. And I was just going to say, I think it comes back to like personal preference and personal choice, like that, for me, mental health challenge or struggling with a mental health condition are kind of interchangeable and make sense in my mind. And something that I typically would prefer people to refer to my depression, anxiety rather than a mental illness, but it totally depends on who you might be talking to. And it can never hurt to just ask the person as well, say, hey, is this okay if I refer to it like this?
Yeah, it's kind of funny that this question came up because it's something that as we were preparing this presentation, the slide about, try saying this instead of that, we had this discussion about, is challenge or struggle, is that okay? And like Maddie said, I think it's totally up to that individual person. If you say one thing and notice the person kind of grimaces, say, oh, I'm sorry, what would you prefer instead? And it's totally fine to make a mistake and just be open to learning. But I will share kind of a funny story since this question came up. I can't remember if it was Jamie or Maddie, but one of you said you prefer, struggles with. And I said, I don't really think that's accurate for me because I don't struggle with depression. I'm very, very good at having depression and living with it. But really, that's a great question. And again, just asking the people that you're talking to what they want, I think is always going to be your best bet. When in doubt, just ask the person.
Awesome. That's super helpful. I totally agree with that. Case by case basis and just being open to feedback that other people will give you. We don't have more questions in the chat yet, just fan mail. So I will read it, but audience, if you have additional questions, pop that in the chat now. Some fan mail. Thank you so much for emphasizing how words can mean different things to different people. As an English teacher, I'm constantly exploring how definitions of the same words can vary and might carry connotations that we're not always aware of. Sometimes we need to examine, discuss, compare, or internalize our internalized personal interpretations of terms in relation to those of others. Y'all are doing a fantastic job. I agree with that. So thank you so much for that. We had another fan mail in here. 3 intelligent and very articulate young people, best DBSA presentation so far, extremely impressed. You give me great hope. Working with the Young Adult Council gives me great hope as well. Thank you very much. And yeah, some of the folks in the audience were not aware of our compassionate language guide, but I'm really glad that we had YAC to go through it with us today. And again, you can find that over at dbsalliance.org. A question here is saying, oh, how do you deal with people language policing you who don't have lived experience? Any thoughts around that, guys?
I think that's a tough one. I don't think I've personally gotten myself into this situation where somebody has language policed me without having lived experience. But I think, you know, a good way to approach something like that is saying, hey, like, I have a differing perspective on this, and this is something that I experience in my own life, and this is my perspective, rather than you know, attacking the other person, which doesn't typically get me anywhere. Just giving your point of view and saying, you know, this is how I've dealt with these things, and so this is what kind of language I'm most comfortable using.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever had an experience of someone language policing me either. I'm just always so busy trying to think, oh, I don't want to language police other people. But it is really difficult to talk to people who don't have that lived experience. It's really hard. But I think Maddie offered some really good points, you know, just politely having a conversation with that person and just explaining your experience in the best way you can. And, you know, not everyone's going to understand what you're feeling, and that's okay. You know, that person is not you. They're not living it. You are. So as long as, you know, you just explain in the best way you can, if that person gets it, great. If they don't, you know, they can read more about it. You know, there's plenty of educational materials that they can read up on, you know, but, you know, some people might not want to do that either. But the important thing is that, you know, you feel validated. And if someone does what a support network is for, you know, when people around us don't understand or they don't have lived experience, it just surround ourselves with people who do understand. But I think Maddie gave some really good examples there.
Great, thank you all. Another question came through, and I think it's such a great one. In support groups and DBSA support groups, sometimes we struggle with triggering topics such as weight, exercise. As a facilitator of support groups, what can we do when we talk about those challenging topics? Olivia, can I pass that one to you because you have so much support group experience? Any ideas on that one?
Yeah, so I used to facilitate for a couple chapters in Kentucky, and I'm out of date on my training, so this might not be DBSA's official stance, but my personal stance is that those topics are very valid for a lot of people living with mental health conditions. You know, for me personally, weight and exercise plays a big role in my anxiety and depression. And so if I was in the facilitating position, I would hate to make a topic off limits just because so many people I think could relate to that. Something that I would suggest if I was in that position facilitating, if there were any offensive words that people brought up in regards to that, you know, like fatty or something like that, I would probably say, hey, I'm not comfortable with that word. Let's try something else. But I would also say, you know, hey, you all, we're diving into this topic and it might be uncomfortable. And so if you want to, you know, get up and grab a drink of water, step in the hallway, run to the restroom. I think it goes back to earlier in this presentation when we were talking about suicide, you know, and I said, hey, if you want to dip out for 5 minutes, totally cool. No offense taken. And so that would be my advice, to make it an environment where people feel comfortable sharing and where people also feel comfortable to get up and walk out if they need to.
I wanted to add to that really quick, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you, Hannah.
No.
But I'm also a support group facilitator, and I think this is a really awesome question. And I want to mention that this is a lot harder to do with Zoom. You know, like Olivia said, if there's a triggering topic and something comes up, you know, it's easy to just go leave the room. You know, you can go just, you know, leave for a little bit if it's something that's that triggering to you. But with Zoom, you know, you have all these people online, and I mean, I guess, you know, you could, if there's a triggering topic that comes up, you can let the group know, and then they can just, mute the volume or, or walk away for a minute. But I feel like it's a little tricky with Zoom sometimes, especially because technology is involved in everything. But that's also something you can do if you're in a support group that is online. Just letting the group know that, hey, something that may be potentially triggering. You're free to mute during this discussion, or I can just let you know when we're done discussing it, stuff like that. But yeah, it's really important that we don't want to completely shy away from talking about these things, because that's why people groups, they want to talk about things. So I think that was a really good suggestion that Olivia had, and I haven't run into anything like that so far in my groups. But if it does happen, I think that's a really great idea to just warn the audience, we're going to talk about this, while respecting other people's boundaries.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for that example. And yeah, Olivia, you did a great job just modeling that for us in the session. I think just naming, if you're going to talk about a hard topic, and giving folks, the permission to make the best choice for them in that time. All right, with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this session for today. But we appreciate all of you attending, and I'm so appreciative to our YAC members for their great work on this presentation, interpreting the DBSA Compassionate Language Guide, which again, you can find on our website at dbsalliance.org. And thank you so much again for being with us. Have a great day, everybody, and keep enjoying the DBSA Summit.